Greg, this is segment 3, the message. Today, the message is here at the beginning of the service. We've heard a rendition of the powerful hymn, Amazing Grace, as our prelude. You also, in the call to worship, heard me say that today we're going to focus on the incredible gift God gives us in grace extended to us. And to illustrate that, I'd like to share for just a few minutes about the origins of this extraordinary hymn. Amazing Grace is, I believe, more than any other hymn in Christendom, at least in the West, sung across traditions, across cultures. The Civil Rights Movement made it one of their key anthems. It preceded immediately Dr. King's message, his I Had a Dream message on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. It's also extraordinarily popular in evangelical circles, Baptists, the free evangelical churches, even the new mega churches today sing popularized versions of the hymn. The tune changes, but the words are still there. And then you find in Catholic services the same words brought into their traditional Mass. Amazing Grace. It was written in a rather obscure Anglican parsonage. The year was 1772, late December. The pastor, Father John Newton, was attempting to write a New Year's Day service hymn. That's something I never attempted as a pastor, but Brother Newton apparently had the gift of beautiful words, and so he was laboring over this hymn. How can I bring hope to the farmers, the agricultural workers here in the town of Olney? Olney, that's the name of the town. 60 miles north of England, farm country. In 1773, on the 1st of January, his works, this hymn, was sung by that congregation. And I would imagine the words that still endure today brought hope and encouragement to those folks who lived day to day for existence from the land. Newton eventually became the pastor of a large and rather prestigious church in the financial district of London, and he took his hymns with him. His mother had taught him all of the great Anglican hymns of that day, most of which we would not recognize. But he continued to write his own. None survived, however, to this period, our period, except Amazing Grace. It was sung by the slaves in the American South, brought by Scottish settlers who became plantation owners. And they created a tune to go with Newton's words. It was different than what the Anglican priest had directed as a tune, a musical tune in England. Rather, what the American slaves developed in their oral tradition was the tune that endures for us today. But the words far exceed the power of the melody. The words have given rise to so many moments of hope, whether in a Baptist revival service, when people would come and give their lives to Christ at the altar after a stirring sermon and invitation, or whether the words were sung when Nelson Mandela was freed from his long imprisonment in South Africa and came to be the leader of ultimately the liberation movement that ended apartheid in South Africa. The words were also sung by this melody in Berlin in 1989, when the Berlin Wall finally came crumbling down. The words brought hope to East Berliners and West Berliners. How could a hymn, a single hymn, have such a diverse impact across human culture? I think it's not because of the poetic power of the words, though they are there. I think it's because of the essential message. The first verse says so much. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. It's number 378 in the Methodist hymnal today. It's in the Presbyterian hymnal. It's in the Southern Baptist hymnal. It's in the Hymn of Psalms in the Catholic Mass book. It's in every one of our traditions. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Newton wrote those words out to be autobiographical. Very briefly, let me say that in years earlier than his becoming a priest in the Anglican Church, he had been, as a young man, a sailor, and ultimately a captain of ships that sailed up and down the Atlantic coast and even over to the New World. But these were not just any merchant ships that Newton staffed and captained. No, these were slave ships going up and down the African coast, the western coast of Africa, to find populations of incarcerated Africans brought by business people to the ports and sold as merchandise. Put on these ships of squalor down below in the crowded and filthy lower deck, chained for the long passage, where their indenture was made permanent and their price paid on the slave markets of the American South. John Newton, yes, as a 25, 30-year-old, was the captain of slave ships. But in 1748, one of those ships, named the Greyhound, was beginning to make its passage across the Atlantic, its deck below full of human cargo, when a great storm came upon the sea. Now, Newton at this point in his life was a rough-hewn, cursing, and very, very, very vile sailor. And yet when the storm came upon him and it appeared that the Greyhound was about to sink, water lashing over the decks, sailors being washed overboard, Newton at the wheel of this sail ship, Newton knew that he might be in his last moments. And so he later recounted in his diary, he began to pray in as earnest a voice as he could muster to God. I am a vile sinner, he wrote. Please, please rescue me. We find that self-reference in the first verse of his magnificent hymn. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The storm finally broke, and Newton was saved. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind to God's presence and God's way, but now I see. Newton gave up his vocation as a slave trader and went back to England and began to study the disciplines of his day to become a Christian, and then a Christian pastor in the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And finally, he was appointed to this little rural church in Olney, England, where he penned his hymn. Born out of abject fear, born out of such depths of insecurity, born out of a sense that he himself, on the deck of the Greyhound in that storm, could not save himself or his cargo. He gave his life, his future, his hope to the one who could quieten the sea. And God did. And John Newton became a great force for good. We face in our day similar challenges. Oh, we're not slave traders, but we are aware, increasingly, especially in these last weeks, that there is in our land still an extraordinary pain caused by our ancestors, and in some, at least unconscious way, maybe caused and perpetuated by us. Racism is a horrible thing, devastating, invites strong-willed and belligerent men and women to kill people of color. Not in 18th century England or slave trading vessels of old, but in the streets of our own cities. Yes, these are days where that part of us, quietly, secretly maybe, is beginning to take a look. How could that be? What can change that? 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, in spite of myself and my heritage, and grace will lead me home. Yes, in this day, God's amazing grace, my brothers and sisters, is an extraordinary gift. Thank God for John Newton's gift with words to tell his own story of redemption. That same gift is available to us. God is with us. We have nothing to fear. And if we trust fully his guidance, so much to base our futures on, that we might be voices of hope, reconciliation, and a beloved community where all know that they are valued children of God. Thank you, John Newton. May we be continually blessed by God's amazing grace. Amen.